Hi, I'm Macy, and today I'm going to be talking about one of history's toughest group of warriors that also happen to be women, the Amazons. Just to preview what we'll cover today, I'll give you a little background on the research I did, I'll introduce you to the Amazons, we'll look at how they were depicted in Greek myth, and then we'll dive into the archaeological evidence and look specifically at their role in warfare, take a look at weapons and battle wounds, and then I want to conclude my presentation by touching a little bit on how gender has affected the study of the Amazons. So as you can see as these pictures at the top, the theme of Amazons is carried on throughout different cultures and throughout time. The first picture is a Greek vase where we see an Amazon in the traditional Scythian wardrobe holding a sword, moving way forward. We see Katharine Hepburn's role in the 1930s Broadway play where she played an Amazon. The play was called The Warrior's Husband. And then this last picture is from a film that actually came out in June of this year, Wonder Woman, which is also based on the Amazons. So it's no wonder that I wanted to study them because it seems like everyone is fascinated with them. And when I started looking at this research, I was really broad. I fell into the trap that thinking that women don't participate in war, not very often, or there's not a lot of evidence for it. And I was actually really pleasantly surprised to find the opposite. So I went from trying to look at all women in all wars fighting at any time in history, and when I got into it, I realized there was too much evidence for it, and so I focused on the Amazons. And even focusing on the Amazons, there's so much information, and people have written books just on their role in one part of the world. So this, by far, this is very brief. There's so much more to know, but anyways, I arrived at my thesis having to go narrower and narrower, and finally I decided to focus on whether or not they existed and weighing out the evidence for that. So my thesis statement: in this research I will evaluate the evidence for the Amazons, drawing upon ancient literature, artwork, as well as the more recent archaeological data. One boob, tatted up, man-hating lesbian stoner virgins that could definitely beat you up. It's a little silly of a question, but there's a lot of misconceptions about the Amazons that are also equally silly, and they have carried on, so I figured I should start by introducing those rumors you might know, you might not, and some of them are true, so it's not all entirely false. One thing that always gets brought up when you talk about the Amazons is that they cut off one of their breasts so they could have better aim shooting an arrow. This is completely false. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. This started back in Greek myths. It started as the reasoning behind it was one of their breasts would get in the way of the arrow, and in order to be able to function their weapons, they would have to cut off a breast. And that rumor has carried on for way too long, and it's absolutely false. Another thing is that they hated men, that they were lesbians, they were virgins. All these rumors about their love lives don't really have any ground whatsoever to stand on. There's many accounts of them working with men, fighting alongside men, having children with men, marrying men, and there's also no evidence that they were lesbians, but that could also just not be recorded. If you look at ancient Greece, they were not really shy about, they weren't homophobic at all. So if there was massive amounts of accounts saying the Amazons were lesbians, I think it would be in there. I think this was more a case-by-case basis, would make more sense. Virgins, that doesn't make any sense. There would be not enough Amazons to carry on the tradition. And the stoner thing has a little bit of grounding, and so does the tattoos. So if you see in the upper left-hand corner, that's Scythian cannabis burning equipment. So basically specifically to burn hemp, to burn cannabis, and we find a lot of those in burials associated with the Amazons. Tattoos, another interesting thing that modern biological testing can determine from the bones, and that is also depicted in ancient texts, that there were a lot of women warriors around this area that did have tattoos. So when we look at Greek myth, there's some themes that we see over and over and over. The Amazons were depicted as their warriors. They fought alongside men, they fought by themselves in tribes of just women. They're from an eastern land that later Greece called Scythia. We see them in the fall of Troy, the Trojan War, the Battle for Athens, and oftentimes we see them dying. We see them fighting some of Greek's heavy hitters, Hercules, Achilles, and so many battles, but more often than not, the Greeks depicted them as being defeated. There's some debate about why this was. Some people, if you look at the women who actually were in ancient Greece at this time, they are pretty much the opposite of the women considered Amazons. They did not participate in war. Their realm was more in the home world. They're a lot more docile and peaceful, and the men of ancient Greece were the ones battling it out. So some theories is that in order to, support the patriarchy, keep those gender binaries in place, they depicted the Amazons as always getting crushed by these Greek male warriors. If you look at the word Amazon and you reflect on the Greek linguistic traditions, whenever the Greeks would name a group of people, they tended to pick the one trait about them that stood out the most and use that in the word. So the word Amazons in Greek language actually breaks down to a people, men and women, with equal genders. So obviously something was going on with these people and how they did gender that struck the Greeks' attention. Around the 5th century, above the Black Sea, Greece started trading with Scythians. And throughout all the texts that document Scythians, one thing you always see is that the women and men were equal. They wore the same clothing, they fought alongside each other, they had equal roles. So one theory is, once the Greeks started trading with the Scythians, they would hear about these people, interact with these people, see this different way of lifestyle, and bring it back home in these traveler tales. And right around the time they start trading with them is right when we start seeing Amazons flooding the artwork and literature of Greece. And Greece at this time was almost obsessed with the Amazons. Besides Hercules, which is like the most famous Greek myth character you can think of, besides Hercules, the Amazons were the next most documented thing in Greek art and literature. So that just shows you how much the demand was for Amazons, how much they were thinking about the Amazons, how striking it was. And it was really popular. When you study the Amazons, one thing that gets really tricky is trying to figure out where exactly they came from, what land they really are pinpointed to. And a lot of times you see scholars using this as a reason why the Amazons were just a figment of Greek imagination. They can't pin them down to a location, so they say they didn't really ever exist. But when we think about this, it's not really logical. The Amazons have always been documented as nomads. They're nomadic people with no written history traveling around on horseback. So it would make sense that you see them all over this area. This map right here is the Scythian Empire, which is now southern Russia. Scythia and Scythians is term now used to refer to this area and to this lifestyle, this group of people. And we see, if you look from the left, there's Thrace, Scythia, Sarmatia, the Black Sea, so all of this area, also known as the steppes, Eurasian steppes, all qualifies as Scythian, usually in the broad term. But we see these repetitive traits in all of these areas. There are slight differences where you go, but you see the same burial practices, you see genders being equal, you see war, you see horses, and you see just basically the same culture going all around. So the first historical text we see documented in the Amazons was Herodotus, and I like to call this the Amazon ethnography, because basically Herodotus, who has been called the father of history, was traveling around above the Black Sea in the 5th century BC, and he's writing down what he's observing, he's writing down what he talks to people about, he's interviewing people, the local legends, the local accounts of history, and makes sense since he's not from this area. One thing he documents about a ton is the Amazons. Genders being equal, women fighting alongside men, is going to be something that stands out to him coming from somewhere else where that is not the norm at all. So 2 really important things we get from his accounts. We get really detailed documents about their burial practices. He doesn't really go into detail about grave goods or what goes into the grave, but he does talk about Scythians having mounds, making mounds all across the grassy areas and burying all their dead there, coming there every summer, and making a tradition to bury their dead as they move around this area. The second thing we get is the origin story of the Sarmatians, which in very brief, you see the Amazons fighting the Greeks. They lose and are captive in a Greek vessel. They end up taking over the vessel, but they're horseback women. They have no idea how to sail a boat. That's not their forte. So they end up crashing onto the shore of Scythia and engage in battle in this strange land. And of course, in Amazon tradition, they're battling back. Scythians, men, warriors, have no idea they're women. When they find out they are, they don't want to fight them anymore. In fact, they want to mate with them. When they have kids with them, they want to dip into this gene pool that's apparently producing these really strong warriors. And they send their youngest men to meet the Amazons, and the Amazons were basically they denied their request because they already had women there in their area that were completely different than them. This area already had its own cultural rules, society was set up, and so they convinced these young men to go with them a little bit more north above the Black Sea and have kids there start their own people and call themselves Sarmatians. So this is important because this is our last account from Herodotus about what happened in the Amazons. We see them forming a new people in this area that's called Sauromatia, and they're continuing with their traditions. They're continuing with their new partners. They're continuing to fight alongside them to keep gender the way it is, raise their children in that way, and then happily ever after, so we see. And that's kind of where we end the story with them. The ending is usually the least exciting part of the story, but when you start looking at the archaeology of this becomes the most important part of the story. Because starting in the 1950s, we see burial mounds, kurgans, just as Herodotus depicted, popping up all over the area where myth once documented them, but then this historical account is documenting them too. So this map right here is pretty broad. This is showing accounts of warrior women from beyond just Eurasia, and all the gray areas is where we find burials with warrior women. So we found over 1,000 warrior graves in Scythia, male and female warriors. And this picture right here, we can see a warrior woman's skeleton with a dagger in her right hand and arrowheads between her legs. And what's so important about this is all this time what is considered a myth, a legend, is now correlating with what we're finding underground. Looking at the weapons that are depicted in Greek myth and artwork and historical accounts, and then looking at the archaeology, it correlates perfectly. The most common weapon you see the Amazons having their go-to that they really excelled at is the bow and arrow. And they used a recurve bow, which was a little bit smaller, and that's what is recorded of them in the past. And then also we find recurve bows buried with women in this area. And this picture right here shows like a speed shooting technique that they were coined with. It's loading the bows as you're shooting, and then makes it go faster. And we also see battle axes. That's another weapon that they often use. And the style and shape that we see in the artwork from the 5th and 4th century is now popping up in these graves in the location that it said it would. Slingshots down here, another depiction. We found graves with a little pile of rocks next to a sling, and it just falls into place that this is confirming what the Greeks were saying all along. Some more weapons. We have spears, swords. Oftentimes in Greek myth, especially if you're seeing an Amazon attacking somebody from Greek myth, they're using a sword. You see them with swords in both hands, daggers, knives, things like that. And then we also see shields. They were always depicted with these half-moon shields. You can see this barefoot Amazon down here. She's actually putting on spurs for her horse, but on her back, that half-moon is the shield that they were always document having, and now we see those popping up in the grave sites as well. Interesting, another thing we found, unisex clothing. They always documented wearing, unless the sexualized, some of the myths were a little bit sexualized, but typically they're seen wearing the same clothes as men, which we find in the graves as well as the armor, which was documented as slices of horse hoofs tied with horse hair to kind of make this shelled armor. We find that as well. Horses were a huge part of Amazon lifestyle and battle. They're always on their horses when they're traveling and when they're fighting. And they were, according to Herodotus and to the ancient Greek myths, they sacrificed their horses, which we see over and over again at the Kurgans. We see remains of horses just in general, and then we see bloodletting and sacrifices that correlate with what we were told in the past. My favorite part to look at is what the biology of the bones really can reveal. That's where we learn the most about the person. So looking at the bones in general, we can determine the sex, the age, hopefully the cause of death, but some signs about the graves, the Scythian graves of the Amazons, as we see just a lifetime of wear and tear that comes with battling. We also see very common to see bowed legs, and that is usually correlated with horseback riding, which we know that they did, and a lot of war-related injuries, so battle wounds. So this skull down here, and you can see the holes right in the top, that is a skull punctured by a battle axe. And then those 4 bones to the side are rib bones, and if you look closely you can see like a slice right through it, and that's been determined to have been slashed with a sword. So not only were these women buried alongside these weapons, they were using these weapons, they were having these weapons inflicted on them. So I think the wounds really just, and being able to determine the sex and being able to see the effect of war on these women really proves that they were active in war. It was often, in the beginning of studying this, a lot of times they would just assume that women were in the graves next to men in the weapons as like a decoration or buried alongside this male warrior. But when you look at the bones and you know this is a woman and you see that she has holes in her head from a battle axe and her ribs have been slashed by a sword, there's no way to deny that she was very much involved in the warfare. So, touching on that, continuing on that, gender bias has had such a frustrating effect on this research that's being remedied now, but originally when these graves were found, any bones found that were buried with weapons were just assumed male because women in war just didn't correlate. So once DNA testing was introduced and we were able to determine that no, these bones are women, it kind of makes you question everything you learned in archaeology. This quote I really appreciated from a thesis on this topic, gender bias in the Amazons. Collier asked, "Where have all the women gone? Where have all the warrior women gone? They've been here all along. We have simply failed to notice them because we did not have the architect of a powerful female as part of our culture." And I think that really sums it up, and I think it really makes approaching research trickier because you have to ask a lot of questions, and I think honestly that's good science. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you learned some more about the Amazons, and I also hope you've taken away a little bit of perspective on just how bias can affect research and why it's important to never stop asking questions. If you're interested in anything I said today, all of my resources are posted here, and thanks again.